How are you finding work so far and the conference?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. Quite frankly, I haven't seen a lot of work. I arrived last night in the dark, and this morning, apart from the conference centre and the hotel, I haven't really seen anything. But I know you have a wonderful university here.
Thank you.
A good friend of mine is professor here. Professor Skidelsky. A very good friend of my father's was Vice Chancellor here, Coutts, one of the first, I think the first Vice Chancellor of the university, if not the first, one of the early ones. So, although I've never been here before, it's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you for those kind words. And for those who didn't attend the summit, could you please summarize the key message from your talk, and which lessons do you think we should learn from the current situation in the Eurozone? And as also you've mentioned the crisis in Russia, which lessons could be learned from that potentially as well?
Right. Well, as far as, because the title of my talk was Europe in Crisis, and my view is that we have two crises. We have the Russian crisis in the East and the Western crisis in the Eurozone. And my talk was mostly, almost all, about the Western Eurozone crisis. And I suppose if I had to summarize this in the talk in a few sentences, I would say Keynes is very rarely right. About once in every 70 years, the last time in the 1930s, and once again now. But it's a massive mistake not to, while it's right to be skeptical about the effectiveness or the suitability of Keynesian solutions, because they probably weren't necessary for most of the post-war period, it's equally mistaken and equally or much more dangerous not to be willing to apply them when we really have a great economic crisis, which we evidently do in Europe. And it's a crisis which has questioned the legal foundations of the Eurozone, because the only way to resolve this crisis, I'm convinced, is through a common expansionary fiscal policy, which wouldn't have to be in the same proportions in every country. In fact, it shouldn't be. In fact, it should probably be more expansionary in those countries which have competitive economies and relatively low debt to GDP ratios, and have in the past behaved responsibly and well, and much less expansionary, if at all, in countries like Greece, which have been behaving badly. But even the countries which wouldn't directly benefit from a common expansionary fiscal policy would benefit indirectly because of the increased growth in the rest of the Eurozone. That's why we need a common policy. At the same time, we need a common policy which would not just be fiscal, but which would combine fiscal and monetary policy in the way in which Keynes envisaged. He didn't say this terribly clearly, because I think one of the problems Keynes had was that he really seriously believed that he was writing a theory which was more general than the standard neoclassical economics. He thought that neoclassical economics was just a special case of his general theory. Whereas in fact, I would argue it's the other way around. The neoclassical is right most of the time, but it's a massive mistake not to know when we have the special Keynesian case and not to respond. Now, what Keynes assumed, and Victoria Chick, who was here at the Economic Summit last year, wrote this very perceptively in a book, which I think she published in 1973 or something like that, which I actually had the pleasure of reading when I was an undergraduate student. Graduate student, master's student at the LSE in the mid-70s. And that is that Keynes fundamentally assumed that that there were situations in which fiscal policy was the only way of delivering money into the economy in a way which increased demand. Because doing it just through the banking system, doing it just through the private sector, wouldn't work because of what he called the liquidity trap, but which we would call a blockage of the credit channel, or the various channels of monetary policy. But fiscal policy, giving people higher unemployment benefit, or paying people to dig holes and fill them in, like Keynes said, or doing more useful things like building roads, buying tanks at the moment, right? These things will actually deliver real increases in demand, rather than simply increasing balance sheets of financial institutions and companies. They'll actually get more real spending out there and get more people employed, right? And therefore get the recovery going. Now, that's really important, because one of the arguments against monetary activism by the extreme, looking for a good word, I suppose German word, ordoliberalism, right? The ordoliberals. But it's not confined just to Germany. The view that monetary policy is going to be ineffective and in fact involves serious dangers, because the accumulation of money balances leads to asset bubbles which can burst down the road and cause further crisis. That view is not absurd. It has quite a lot of truth in it. So if you're just doing monetary policy, not funneling the money into the economy through the fiscal deficit, you are creating those risks of not being effective and actually even being dangerous. If, on the other hand, you pursue a pure fiscal policy and just borrow money, then what you're doing is increasing the debt burden, the public debt burden in economies, which can be dangerous down the road, and what's more, may cause the fiscal policy to be ineffective, because people will say, gosh, well, this money has, new classical economics, Ricardian equivalents and all that. This money will have to be repaid, and what's more, the state may even go bust, so I better hang on to my money, right? But if your fiscal deficit is financed by money creation, then of course the consolidated balance sheet of the public sector doesn't increase, right? Because the government money is owed to the central bank, which belongs to the government. So the debt burden doesn't increase. So this would be a really good policy if it weren't, it's an obvious and sensible solution. Don't try to look in the crystal ball, read the book. It's called A General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. There's a small problem. In the Eurozone, or in the European Union, we've actually deconstitutionalized monetary financing of fiscal deficits. So we have a big problem. And that's really what the talk is about.
Thank you. And also, as you mentioned from your previous academic experiences, and well, current as well, and your experience of being taught economics, how there was a big transition from Keynesian school of thought being the dominant one into the monetarism taking over. What would you say needs to be taught more now, and does anything needs to be changed in the teaching of economics, and how would this help the policymakers?
I don't know what would help policymakers. I think that most of them are beyond help, and I'm not just here, not just in Europe, and I speak as a policymaker. But if we think about, what needs to be changed in the teaching of economics, almost everything. I mean, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that I have a wonderful idea. The basic problem with economics is that economics is a little bit like having a Lamborghini which you drive over the kind of roads that you probably, well, I haven't been in Africa for a long time, but that I would assume that we probably have in the provincial parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Right? It's like having a Lamborghini that you're trying to drive over roads with roads with holes that big, that deep, right? 20 centimeter holes. So we have this incredibly powerful formalistic formalization. We have these incredibly powerful formalizations, these mountains of theory which produce mice of actual practical applicability. And in real practice, it's really some very simple ideas that can be applied. Of course, there's a lot of economic techniques that's useful when you're doing empirical work. That's a different matter. But when you're actually thinking about policy, most of this model making can really be reduced to a few simple principles. And it's mostly a matter of how perfect people's foresight is. And the result of putting so much stress on that and making economics so much of a behavioral science is that we abstract from a lot of very important empirical knowledge which we wouldn't get from econometric tests. I mean, from simple knowledge. How often do we go to a course where we hear about the legal constraints on policy, right? How often do we, when we're doing micro economics, do we actually go out and do we actually read laws and acts of parliament that set the framework for people's behavior, let alone case law, right? So the problem is, all of economics should be an applied discipline, right? And we should be reading laws, reading constitutions, looking at historical cases, instead of which, and that should be 90% of the time, and then techniques and econometrics, let alone general equilibrium theory, should be sort of part of the general education, but it shouldn't be, this is my deep belief, shouldn't be the shouldn't be the core of what economists learn. Right? They should have that as part of their intellectual furniture. They must have it as part of their intellectual furniture. But the intellectual furniture should be 10-20% of the course, and not, as it is, 80-90% of the course. And I think then we would, if we were taught economic history in an interesting way, right, as the history of economic policy making, right, I think we would also be more creative economists, more creative researchers, and better support for the poorer policymakers.
Thank you. And as for you offered an ideal solution to the debt sovereign crisis in the Eurozone. and but in the real world, it's really hard to achieve an agreement between all the governments.
I don't think it's an ideal solution. It's actually a third best. I mean,
Third best.
It's actually a third best. But nevertheless, it's better than what threatens us if we don't do that, yes.
But what I'm saying is unrealistic to achieve such an agreement between all the governments. Would you say?
Not immediately, no. I mean, no, let me put it another way. I don't think it's unrealistic. And as I think it was Dr. Johnson said, nothing concentrates the mind as the prospect of shortly being hanged. Since we're all facing the prospect of shortly being hanged because the collapse of the Eurozone, I mean, it's not likely to happen immediately, but it's certainly not unthinkable. So I think this is now concentrating minds. And I wouldn't say it's impossible, it's possible and necessary, but it won't happen immediately. So do carry on with your question. Yes. And it may not happen at all. You may be right, so carry on.
I was wondering for your forecast how, in the case in which you think it would happen, how would it happen and how much time?
Well, basically we have three possible scenarios, right? Mm-hmm. We have the scenario that the Germans claim to believe in, which is that structural reform alone will cause recovery. I can't think of cases that have happened in large closed economies where structural reform alone has led to recovery. In small open economies it has happened, but almost always with significant depreciation as well. So I think that's extremely unlikely. Simply persisting with structural reform and austerity will lead to recovery. The second possibility is the extreme opposite, which is catastrophe, collapse of the Eurozone, which of course would be economic, would lead to both economic and political catastrophe for everybody in Europe, with the possible exception of President Putin. Would be, of course, a disaster also for Germany. The third possibility is what I call the 3 zeros scenario. Zero inflation, which is nice, zero interest rates, which are nice, and zero growth, which is a lot less nice. And that persisting for a long time. The question is that a stable equilibrium? And the problem is that there are reasons to suppose, although we don't know, that it's not likely to be a stable equilibrium. What's happened in Greece with the election of Syriza, with the Syriza government, what's quite likely to happen in Spain with the election of, well, with Podemos coming along, and most dangerously, what may well happen in France with the possible election of Marine Le Pen as president in 2017. All these indicate major risks to even to the 0-0. So the positive scenario, I believe to be impossible. The neutral scenario is subject to serious risks. And the negative scenario is catastrophic, but I'm not suggesting that it's certain, right? And that's more or less where we are. That's why it's so important to keep trying to convince everybody to do what's needed.
Thank you. And just as a final question, not touching on the Eurozone, possibly, from drawing onto your experiences in policy making, ranging from advising the Russian government on the transition to being the finance minister in Poland in the crisis time, and to your academic career with the research, what would you say were the highlights of the career, and what are your most memorable moments?
Wow! That's the problem with being 64. There's a lot of those memorable moments. I would still say that the most memorable moment of all was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So that's the most memorable moment. But there have been a lot of them, and I think it's one of the things that make it worth being an economist. Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.